Hello, I'm Gabrielle from SpeechKids and Raising Orchid Kids, where we teach little kids to talk and help parents understand their little kids. And today I am delighted to welcome Emma Basch to our podcast. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. Go ahead and tell the folks who you are and what you do.
Okay. My name is Emma Basch. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist based out of Washington, D.C. I specialize in perinatal and reproductive mental health, which means I am a therapist that works with folks from before having babies through to the other side of early parenting and everything in between: infertility, pregnancy loss, reproductive health, perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, early parenting, adoption, the whole thing.
Oh my gosh.
The whole thing. I run a group practice here in Washington, D.C., where we have 5 of us clinicians who specialize in this, but we see clients all over the country. And I'm also a mom to 2 little people. I've got a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old who are finishing up their last week of school.
Amazing. It's a busy time.
It is.
Yeah. So that I don't forget to ask you later, where can people find your practice?
Fantastic. My website is dremmabasch.com. That is the easiest way to find me and my team, but we are also on Facebook if you look up Dr. Emma Basch and Associates. And
Perfect.
on Twitter, I think I'm myself on Twitter, Dr.
Okay, and it's Basch.
There's a secret C in there. Yes.
The secret C. All right, perfect. So, okay, now that that's out of the way, we are going to talk about, there's like about 16 topics from what you just said that I really want to go into. And so we're going to pick one and then we'll have you back. But there is something that happens. You said the word, it's a fancy word, matrescence. Mm-hmm. What is that?
It is a fancy word. So the word matrescence is a term coined that basically means the physical, emotional, hormonal, and social transition to becoming a mother. So you may,
snort. Yeah.
So you may hear how that sounds a lot like the word adolescence. And of course, that's where the term comes from, sort of like a parallel to adolescence. When we think about adolescence, we think about puberty and teenagers and kiddos turning into young adults. We kind of understand there's massive physical changes, there's hormonal changes, identity changes, social changes, role changes, basically everything during that period of time. And the idea with matrescence is that the experience of becoming a mother, and I'd argue becoming a parent in general, because these transitions happen to dads, they happen to non-binary folks. Like, this is not unique, although that is where this term comes from, is to kind of put into some context what happens when we have children and how we probably should give people a lot more space to figure out what that massive shift means in their process to parenthood, just as we may give some wide berth around adolescent and say, yeah, there's a lot going on here. It makes sense that they might be having a hard time or not quite know how to do something or feel uncomfortable in their body, or, you know, basically the whole gamut of experiences we might expect in teens. Same thing's happening when we become parents, and yet we're not really framing it that way. So
that is fascinating. I think for me, I'm going to speak from personal experience. There was a huge shift when I became a parent that I was not at all, to your point, I was not at all expecting. My whole life, I had thought, yes, of course, I'm going to be a parent. That was never a question for me. And so then I did it and I was like, oh my God, what have I done? I had a postpartum depression that was significant and lasted about 8 months before my husband looked at me one day. We were talking about this the other day, actually, because my son is almost 20 now. He looked at me one day, he's like, I don't think it's supposed to be this hard for you. But we didn't know that it wasn't supposed to be that hard. I guess I want to stop there for a second and just, can you sort of speak to that a little bit? Not postpartum depression in particular, but sort of this transition. Like, why don't we expect it to be hard?
I think, right. Why don't we expect it to be hard?
And then also, like, how hard is too hard, right? Like, so there's room in there.
Yes. Yes. And it is a really subtle distinction, but I think the premise of your question is an important one. Like, why are we going into this blind? It's not as though there are not lots of parents to look ahead to. And I think it has a lot to do with a lot of the social constructions of parenthood and how we're supposed to be, that it's supposed to happen naturally and we're supposed to love it and it's supposed to be easy and comfortable. And this reality of what it looks like for many folks is messy. It's ambiguous. We're not so great with ambiguity and uncertainty. A lot of people experience shame as a primary feature of that transition, right? Of feeling all of a sudden like they don't know how to do something, or the things they thought about themselves don't feel right. They don't feel at home in their bodies. Their relationships are shaky. Shame shuts us down. So I think that is the other thing that happens, is that we remain relatively silent. And I think we parent in isolation more than we need to. And certainly the pandemic has brought that into focus, what it's like to really parent in isolation.
Literal isolation.
Literal isolation. And certainly in my practice, I've had a lot of folks who became parents during the pandemic and had no frame around them, and their experience with that isolation caused them so much anxiety because there was no mirror of the things that which is supposed to be hard. To your question of what is too hard, which is a great question. And that's a question I bump into all the time when folks will come to me and sort of say, is this just because I'm a new parent, or do I have depression, or do I have an anxiety, or is there something that needs more intervention? It's not like there's a line. But what we look for as clinicians is how much impact this is having on a person, right? Like, how intense are the symptoms? How long are they happening? Are they impacting their functioning? Is it all the time, or is it occasional? Is it coloring most of your experience? That's kind of how we think about things, with this little gentle exception that I'll just have to caveat that for birthing parents, those 2 weeks after having a baby, when people hear the term baby blues, many people may be familiar. We sort of see that as fairly typical for people to have a lot of emotional up and downs.
Yeah, for those 2 weeks.
Exactly. And that's the key part, right? Like if it doesn't end, it's a good idea to go check in with someone, right? Going and checking in with someone doesn't mean you necessarily have postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety. I'd argue we all have postpartum adjustment disorder, every one of us, when we have children, in whatever way we have children, birthing, adoption, dads, everybody, which may need some extra support.
So it's funny, I'm feeling compelled to talk about this today. So here we go. So in my case, I have 2 children. So my now almost 20-year-old, again, 8 months in. And so that was the summertime. My husband looked at me. He's like, I don't think it's supposed to be this hard. I went and I saw a therapist. She said, because I thought maybe I'm just not doing this properly or something. And she suggested some medication. And so talk therapy combined with the medication really helped bring the floor up, because to your point, I was sleeping every time the baby slept and sleeping all night. So I had a goal that summer. The only thing on my to-do list was to, besides daily feeding, of myself and the baby, which that always got done, was to install the convertible car seat from the bucket. Never got done. I had 3 months, no job, no nothing to do, and it never happened. And so those were kind of the benchmarks of, as we retrospectively looked back, like, oh yeah, this was affecting every aspect of my life, right? Yes. And of course, all the studies, I don't have to tell you this, but indicate that maternal depression, poor infant outcome. That wasn't happening in my house because I was directing everything I had to my child. But so with number 2, the interesting thing for me anyway was I had those 2 weeks. After those 2 weeks postpartum, I was like, ooh, this doesn't feel right. I'm intensely happy that I have this baby, but I don't feel it. And that was my trigger immediately. The second time's a charm, right? Got on the medication and everything like it was such a different experience. Huge. Now I'm not prescribing medication for everybody, but I am saying like that made a huge difference for me, because clearly there was something physiological happening.
Absolutely. And
some people recover from hormonal shifts like that.
Yeah, I mean, so, we don't quite know exactly why some people's course of depression, anxiety look one way and some people look different. We kind of think there's different phenotypes, so different types of postpartum mental health concerns that can happen. For some people, it's very physiological, very hormonal, probably has a lot to do with your own genetic loading. For some people, it's fairly transient, right? So some people are also more hormonally sensitive than other people, right? Some people are less hormonally sensitive.
Present.
Yeah. And that's the stuff that I wish was asked about before people had children, so that you could sort of gear up and understand your risk factors. And if you have a partner or a family member, could kind of understand these are some sensitivities you may have. You're not destined to have this outcome, but people around you can look for those soft signs and that you described so well. Like the car seat's such a good example that's so specific to you, but right, a sign that like this simple thing is just not working in the right way.
Yeah.
So people can have a better sense of that. So yeah, some people, the great thing, if we could say there's a great thing about perinatal depression, anxiety, those things are treatable. People can get better, but they need to get treated. And so what happens a lot for folks who don't get treated, at least in my practice, is I'll get people later. So maybe this time it's their second baby, or maybe it's a couple years later, and there's something is just not right. And when we actually understand what's going on, whatever was going on for them never was really treated or resolved. It's more like they figured out how to muscle through. And here they were still suffering.
We're so good at muscling through and ignoring all of those signs and symptoms, aren't we? It's like modern humans very good at overriding any natural instinct.
Totally. And we've got a lot of probably hyper overfunctioner parents who are, and I'll put myself there, who are really good at muscling through and can kind of get bit years later, like, oh, wait a second, I'm not okay here.
It's interesting to me as we're having this conversation. So one of the things in my practice where that we're doing is we're coaching parents who are raising orchid kids, right? These are these kind of hard, highly sensitive, either with developmental delays or not, hard to parent sometimes kiddos, right? There's nothing like a child who's, I'm putting air quotes, hard to manage to really trigger all of our own unresolved kinds of stuff. And if we're compounding that with this experience of shifting into a new identity, I heard you sort of reference it obliquely with child number 2. Like if you've got 1, you can muscle through. If you've got 2, and then number 2 or either number 1 is it all sort of challenging.
It all compounds. Right. And so then we're bumping into whatever's happening with our own psychological and physical health. But I think what you're also alluding to is the ways in which we feel unsteady, right? Going back to this like adolescent parallel, if you can go back to being a teenager and the things that you didn't know how to do and how hard that felt and how much scaffolding and support we might provide someone. Okay, but now then someone hands you this baby and you leave the hospital and you may have some supports, right? But like there's no manual. And then
I remember leaving the hospital and being like, they've clearly made a mistake. Like, they should not be allowing me to go home with this creature.
Exactly. And then if that creature ends up being all of our children are going to challenge us in particular ways, but if that creature challenges us in a way that chafes against our own stuff, our sense of I know what I'm doing, or I'm good enough, or that, or the ways in which we had our own, or maybe ways in which we were parented correctly or parented in ways that caused us harm, it can create this really a firestorm of feeling like I'm having a very hard time with my child. This means a terrible thing about me. This means X about my child. Okay, now I feel guilty and shame, like rinse and repeat. And I imagine that's sometimes how parents might show up to you.
For sure. Yeah.
Traumatized experience.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and then, right, their child is now doing things that nobody else's child is doing. So then add like, clearly I'm a terrible parent and I don't know what I'm doing because my child is behaving in this way. That just, right. Add another layer.
Exactly. It's like layer on layer on layer on layer. Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, okay. So when when people come to you,
Yeah.
what's going on with them, and then how do they get better? Like, how does that work?
So, people are coming to me in a lot of different phases, but when we're talking about new parents, it's usually a cluster of things that are happening. It's a depression and anxiety. I'd say often even maybe more anxiety
Hmm.
seem to be a big feature. There's a lot of concern often about the parenting, right? So the idea of I'm doing it wrong or I'm not good at it or I'm going to cause harm. We see a lot of sort of spinny, ruminative thoughts is a big feature. I'd say most of the clients who I see in the postpartum period. So various versions of that. Getting better looks different for everybody.
Mm.
So I have different sort of therapy modalities that I practice from. So I'm an integrative provider, not to use a bunch of buzzwords, but I do a lot of trauma-based work. I know EMDR is one of the that I bring in. I also do a lot of ACT therapy, which stands for acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a lot of about mindfulness and some sort of third wave cognitive behavioral therapy. So various versions of therapy that are working top down. So how we're talking and thinking about things, but also bottom up. So what's happening in our nervous system and our sort of somatic experiences.
Mhm.
So to me, that's how people get better. We meet clients in a comprehensive way. Um, Often there's meds, not always. And
Yeah.
that's, will be kind of like you described, us collaborating with a psychiatrist who will prescribe medication and work in tandem with me to help, I loved your language, build that floor.
Yeah.
So then we can do everything on top of that. So we make it really solid.
That was my therapist. She was like, "You're living in the basement of the building and you don't need to live there. You can take the elevator up a couple of floors and live there. There's more light."
How sturdy that is. So there's so much more light. Right. Absolutely. And that light allows us to create a little distance between our experiences that we're having and our sense of self. And I think that's a feature always with depression and anxiety, but certainly with new parenting, that these symptoms that we're having, I'm bad at this, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm a failure, feel ashamed, start to feel like self rather
Yeah.
than experiences that we're having as we're navigating this terribly challenging but rewarding journey of parenting.
And it's so interesting. But I always say, particularly in this area, but I also think, particularly in the West, particularly in 2022, like many adults are walking around thinking they're like super competent, smart, successful people because of their external accomplishments,
Yes.
not because they've spent any amount of time in sort of self-examination of like, actually, I am good enough. Like the number of, myself included, by the way, like I've done a lot of work on like, yeah, you're enough. Because
I
we're all taught that we're not.
could not agree more. I think like one of the features I've seen, so I've been practicing here in DC a while. Before that was New York, a lot of like super smart, amazing, interesting clients who have really developed self-esteem that is really contingent on this external sense of accomplishment and self-worth. And then they become parents and they don't know what to do, which they're not supposed to. And their sense of self gets crushed.
Yeah,
Right.
because baby can't validate us.
Mm.
3-year-olds don't care about your legal degree.
Oh, oh,
Right?
oh.
10-year-olds, whatever.
I know, right?
Right? They cannot give us what we crave. They can't provide external validation. Quite the opposite, in fact.
Totally. So much work that I end up doing with people is about kind of cultivating their own self-compassion and kindness. It's a skill that I'm hoping will be different with kiddos who are raised today, but I think many of us did not grow up knowing how to like put hand on heart and say, I am worthy, I am good enough, and to really mean it based on nothing external. So bring that in a lot. I think we all need it.
Yeah.
As well as this reminder that maybe we didn't get the memo about parenting, that we not only like are we not supposed to know how to do it, but we really don't have to get it perfect. And in fact, my favorite theorist to quote is Winnicott, who's this whole idea of a good enough parent. Who's a psychoanalyst and pediatrician, but the idea is that there's a million ways to get it right because our kids are not robots and we're not robots. There's some clear wrongs, right? So obviously we're not talking about abuse or harming children, but the errors that we make in responsiveness and attentiveness are probably good because the world is imperfect, right? And our kids have to be resilient and learn how to do that. And so if we mess up, we're probably okay.
Yeah, when parents come to see me, I often, because they're praying they're not doing something wrong, and that's why their child has a speech and language delay, or when they come to raising orchid kids that, they're like, did I do this? Is this my fault? And I say the simple fact that you're asking the question is a really good indicator that no, you're not like doing this. This is not being caused by you. Just asking, being aware enough to ask the questions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I see that a lot as well, right? That blame. And I understand that based on how we think of ourselves as parents, but also some of the messages we get and the pressure on us to do it right and to do it in particular ways, it can feel like we're very, very sort of precarious path that we're on.
Yeah. And we were not meant to do this on our own. I mean, for millennia, there were intergenerational groups, and if you were done, you gave the baby to whoever, somebody else who was related to you.
Truly, truly cannot stress that enough. And, there's interesting research cross-culturally on kind of how perinatal mood and anxiety disorders show up and kind of the protective factors of raising children in community for our own mental health. And I think those of us who've had the privilege of having community around us can feel the difference.
Yeah. We could go on for hours.
Yes, we could.
We're going to do this again, but for now, we're going to leave it there. Remind us again, if people want to find you, Emma Basch.
Yes, so my website is dremmabasch.com. The practice is Dr. Emma Basch and Associates. You can Google either and find me that way, or on Facebook or Twitter. I'm around.
Perfect. We will do this again. Thank you for being here.
This was a delight. It was so good to speak with you.
You too.
All right.